There are heavy hearts at Sydney University, with two cultural gems, the Macleay Museum and the Nicholson Museum, both announcing that they're shutting up shop, with plans afoot to relocate to a new, even bigger museum. The Macleay has the oldest natural history collection in Australia, while the Nicholson has the largest antiquities collection in the Southern Hemisphere. Reporter Anne Barker met some of the custodians of some very rare and treasured antiquities.
Head up several flights of stairs to the attic of one of Sydney University's oldest buildings and you step back into another world.
It's often called Sydney's best kept secret because it's really difficult to navigate to.
The Macleay Museum was born of an obsession that began in London in the 1790s. Alexander Macleay had arguably the world's largest private collection of insects. Such was his fascination for bugs, he blew much of his fortune on them. So at the age of 60, he took a job as Colonial Secretary to New South Wales, setting sail with his wife and children and the entire insect collection.
Charles Darwin, when he came in on the Beagle, he came to see the collection, and it's one of the reasons we have a flea from an armadillo, which he ate the armadillo in Baja Blanca, and he got the flea from the armadillo and gave it to William Sharp Macleay, Alexander's son.
That collection formed the basis of the Macleay Museum, which today has nearly 400,000 exhibits. But it's about far more than insects. This is where you go when you want to see a wombat fetus, as one does, or the skeleton of the now extinct thylacine, or even an 1850s anatomical man made entirely from papier-mâché. Since it opened its doors in 1891, the Macleay has been an important teaching museum, giving scientists and historians rare access to objects they're studying. It's helped demystify some of Australia's most unusual species.
One of the most amazing creatures ever discovered on Australia when white settlement began was the platypus, and a lot of people believed it was a hoax. They thought that it was some sort of rat or mole that had a duck's bill sewn onto the front of it because they'd never seen an animal before that looked like this.
And this one-eyed skull was originally mistaken for the mythical bunyip, but later proved to be just a deformed horse. But as the Macleay collection has grown, the museum has been squeezed into a smaller and smaller space. Barely 3% of exhibits are on display. The rest are crammed into cupboards and any available space. Stuffed kangaroos and giant birds peep out from dusty corners.
Previous curators used to talk about opening a cupboard and having the contents tumble out on them, and I had that happen to me with an antelope skin from one cupboard. You think about a building of this size, we're now a third of the space. There's simply not enough room to put everything.
This would be Sydney Harbour.
The Macleay is also home to a rare and very valuable collection of photographs that show Sydney and the university in its earliest days. Many are hidden from public view, along with this early stereograph viewer, not unlike today's 3D glasses.
This is a very simple handheld viewer that you would just be able to hold and look at your stereograph and you'd have the 3D effect.
Across the quadrangle at the Nicholson Museum, there's a similar squeeze-on space. It's home to the largest antiquities collection in the Southern Hemisphere, many of them discovered or collected by famous women. Archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon was a pioneer in the Middle East, and writer Agatha Christie even had a hand in some of the museum's exhibits.
The Max Muller one's not particularly famous nowadays outside of archaeological circles, but he was the second husband of Agatha Christie. And so she would actually journey to modern-day Iraq and modern-day Syria with him in the 1930s and again in the 1950s after the Second World War to work on his excavations. And we know that she cleaned them from a lot of her own writing, a lot of her own references within her autobiography. So again, it's kind of interesting that the modern historical stories of some of these objects are just as fascinating as their ancient past as well.
With 100,000 visitors a year, the tiny Nicholson Museum is bursting at the seams. Now, finally, there are plans for a bigger, brand new building to relocate both museums and the university's art collection, with plans to be more interactive and engage an even wider public. Craig Barker says even an antiquities museum has to move with the times.
The minute that a museum stops changing, it dies. And I think that anyone who thinks that museums should be quiet places and reflective places have it wrong.
The new museum will combine the best of both worlds. Modern technology will be used to bring ancient artefacts to as many people as possible. Already the Nicholson Museum uses Lego to make history more accessible to younger people.
Things like Lego models, things like 3D scanning and printing, things like virtual reality tours are really the 21st century equivalent of our modern curious minds wondering what it was like back in the past. And so, yeah, I think that they're a great tool.
But moving ancient and priceless museum exhibits will be no easy task, and relocating the giant cedar cabinets from the Macleay Museum could prove even more difficult.
The big cabinets that people really love about this space, they were winched up through a hole in the floor around there somewhere. Once they were up, the floor was sealed, and that's why they survived the 70s. They survived that whole period of time when people were changing things to be modern because we simply couldn't move them out again.
The old Macleay Museum has now closed to allow maximum time to pack up and move, even though the new museum won't open for 2 years. Its design is still under wraps, but it's funded by the same Chinese businessman, Chow Chak Wing, who funded another university building at Sydney's UTS, the so-called paper bag. If that building's any guide, the new Chow Chak Wing Museum promises to be a very new and modern design for some of Australia's oldest artefacts.